I owe somebody $5. Where are you? No. Was it you? Did I get my IOU back? You can bring it back next time, but I need to, otherwise you're going to show up at my office every week with my business card demanding $5. Which is rational. Okay. Last 3 weeks. You ready for this year to be over? Who's graduating? All right. Are you ready to graduate? Are you going to graduate? That's in my hands, right? No, I'm joking. Okay. So we have 2 lectures this week, 2 lectures the following week, and then 2 lectures the week thereafter. The last lecture in this course is a bunch of fun where I'm going to basically show you that all the annoying models I've taught you over the past however many weeks, seems like forever, time flies when you're having fun, actually work when I set up the incentives right? So a whole bunch of experiments, involves a lot of chocolate and a lot of fun. So we really only have 5 sort of hardcore lectures. Max, why are you wasting 1 whole lecture on fun? Because that's the only lecture that people ever remember 5 years out, right? So they're like, oh yeah, I remember price discrimination. Oh yeah, I remember marginal product. That was the time he made people make widgets on stage. So it's my way of, when you do pottery in college, which I think some people still do, right? You form the vase and then you burn it in an oven to solidify what you've shaped. So the last lecture is my way of trying to figure out ways to actually imprint this neoclassical theory in your brain. There's also, for those of you who hate the more is better assumption, there's Claire Brown's Buddhist economics class. I don't know, anybody in the Buddhist economics class? All right, if you're interested in a class that does questions this more is better assumption and this sort of semi-greedy, let's not call it semi-greedy, really greed-driven society we live in, go check out Claire Brown's Buddhist economics class. It questions that paradigm. I thought that was kind of neat. It's also on the Berkeley homepage. Stop babbling, Max. Teach me some economics. Here we go. Lecture 20. Slides are up. Also, regrades for midterm 2. If you want it regraded, you have to hand me a written request by end of lecture today, and then I will take a look at it and see if we made any mistakes. But Max, you haven't posted the answer key. I know. Right? If you think I did something wrong, explain to me why it's wrong. I know. I'm a jerk. I've been told this by so many people now that it sort of just rolls off my back. Okay. Last time. Monopoly. So we're almost done with monopoly, where there's a single firm in a market that produces the entire market output. All right? This, of course, means that the firm doesn't just choose its output by looking at what market price is and determining its profit-maximizing output, but it chooses, by choosing what quantity it produces, it implicitly determines price. Right? So this is tricky in multiple ways, in a way that you didn't think was tricky before, but that it turned out to be really important. If you face the entire demand curve, all of a sudden, your marginal revenue is different from average revenue. For the perfectly competitive firm, we know, of course, if you sell 1 more unit, you always get P dollars for it, so average revenue is always market price, and marginal revenue is always market price too. But if you face the whole downward sloping demand curve, as you increase output, price drops for all units sold. So you lose some for the units sold, and you gain some for the units, additional units you sell, and that quantity, that trade-off, that marginal revenue changes along the linear demand curve. We then show that if you have a nice linear downward sloping demand curve, which are essentially all the demand curves we ever see in this course, the marginal revenue curve, which is the one you use to set profit maximizing output levels, if marginal revenue equals marginal cost, has the same y-intercept on the price axis as the demand curve, but twice the slope. Okay? Remember that. So the firm goes out and sets marginal cost equal marginal revenue. That determines the quantity, and then looks up at the demand curve and sets price up there. We showed that there's a significant amount of welfare loss because you're producing less than the perfectly competitive or socially efficient output level. And we also showed that taxing actually increases the deadweight loss from having a monopolist relative to maybe some other policy that we're going to talk about today. We then briefly said, well, maybe a subsidy would help. It would, if you're just an economist, but all of you wisely have chosen to study interdisciplinary topics such as either political economy, tax, development studies, or business, and you realize that the political economy here, of course, is an important determinant as to whether you can pass a certain policy or not. So subsidizing monopolists is not a really popular policy option. Okay, so it's not something we can effectively do in the market. So that's where we stopped, and then I drew this crazy picture about a natural monopoly, which whenever I get panicked, I do a bad job. So let me think about something called a natural monopoly. This is where we left off last time, and there was a slide before that I just skipped that was just a setup for the natural monopoly. But think of a firm that essentially can produce the entire whatever output at a lower cost than 2 firms half its size. So what I'm thinking of here is a firm that has increasing returns to scale over the relevant production level. So if this here is Q, this here is dollars, what I'm thinking of, actually let me draw this a little bit lower. If these are my average costs, and these are my marginal costs here, if these are my average costs and my marginal costs, this is a firm in the long run that has increasing returns to scale, right? If you're thinking about a firm producing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 units, for example, one firm producing 8 units can produce it at this average cost versus 2 firms producing 4 units produce it at a much higher cost. So from a cost perspective, it's much better to have 1 firm produce the entire market output than having 2 firms producing half, right? So this makes sense in the sense that this may be a motivation to actually have a monopolist in a market. Now, what types of firms look like this? They're usually firms with huge capital investments. You can think of utilities, people who pump away the sewage out of neighborhoods. These are all really attractive industries, usually power generation, sewage, cable television to a certain degree. I don't know if you have any other good examples. Utilities is always good. Yeah, that's the ones we think about. So do we like utilities? Oh yeah, Bayern is playing Real Madrid next week. I like my utilities. I need to watch that, right? So I'm willing to pay a lot for that. Do you like sewage? Actually, it's very unattractive. But if you buy a house, right, there's a huge pipe in your garden that is underground, and anything the bath water and all the other stuff automatically flows into a sewage system, goes to a sewage treatment plant. You never see it. You never see any evidence of it. It's just taken care of, and you pay a certain amount of money each month for that service. Is this something we like, or would you prefer to have a big hole in your backyard with a lid on it? That then occasionally somebody comes with a hand-driven pump and pumps stuff into it. Gross, right? Ew. It's like that Michelle Obama, Jimmy Fallon skit. Ew, that was really funny. But the point here is utilities are really useful. So why is Max making such a big deal out of these natural monopolies? Okay, let's take 2 scenarios. First one, it's one firm offering this service, right? Bigger firms drive smaller firms out of the market because they are just able to offer the service more cheaply. So let's say you have one firm that faces a market demand curve that looks like this. Okay, if this here is market demand, that's a bad market demand curve. Let me retry. I know it's annoying. It has to intersect this thing here. Let's do 9, 9. Okay, this here is market demand. So if this firm actually acts as a monopolist, I know the marginal revenue curve goes down here. This is marginal revenue, right? Same intercept as the demand curve using the famous big dot theorem. Twice the slope, so it cuts at 4.5 because the demand curve cuts at 9. So this firm maximizes profit where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So it produces 3.5 units of output and charges this monopoly price right here. Okay, that's the monopolist. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. That's where profits are maximized. And then the price the firm charges is the one at the demand curve. So this firm making positive profits, if there are no fixed costs here, if these are just average variable costs of operation, then the profit you can read right off the average cost curve here at this quantity. This firm is raking in huge amounts of money and is producing less than the socially optimal amount. Well, that raises the question, what's the socially optimal amount here, right? It's the amount where price, which is the inverse demand curve, D equals P of Q, is equal to marginal cost. So I need to extend my marginal cost curve a tiny little bit here. So where price is equal to marginal cost, the optimal production level is right here. This is Q star. That's what we would want the total level of sewage treatment services to be in a certain town. Would you like to live in a town where the optimal level of sewage treatment is delivered, or would you like to live in a town where sort of less than half of the optimal level of sewage treatment is being delivered? I think the choice is clear, right? I don't know how many of you travel to very interesting places across the world, but there are lots of places where we deliver less than the optimal amount of sewage treatment. So we have this program in the summer called the Environmental Leadership Program, where we bring in environmental leaders from across the world. And last year there was a woman from one of the biggest slums in Kenya, and we spent 3 hours talking about sewage treatment. Unfortunately, the depressing thing about this is the way it works in a lot of these slums. Nobody has water, that is pumped into the houses and toilets. So what people do is they buy little plastic baggies for very little amount of money, and then at night, when it's dark and nobody sees it, they throw them out the windows, right? So you have these bags of sewage basically littering the entire slum, which is, I don't need to tell you that plastic bags don't seal when you throw them out a window often. So you essentially have public health hazard just all over this area, which leads to all kinds of disastrous public health outcomes. Which having a constant state. This is a very sad and not very appetizing lecture, but. If you have a lot of the bugs that tend to thrive in sewage floating around and affecting the drinking water that you actually get, and you constantly have your intestines in the state of upheaval, let's put it that way, that has really terrible consequences on your long-run ability to actually hold a job and act in ways that raises your long-run earnings. So sewage treatment, while it's something we don't talk a lot about in intermediate microeconomics lectures, is one of the most important topics that we as a species interested in worrying about long-run poverty outcomes deal with. So there's a prize out there for a new toilet, for example, right? So if you develop a new toilet that's cheap and does what it's supposed to do, in the setting, you can actually make the world a much better place. But let's stop talking about toilets for a second. So what we've got here is, let's figure out what the socially optimal output level is. We figured it out. It's where marginal cost equals price. It's Q star right here. And what I showed you last time is that if we set the price at this point, right, if this here is P star, which of course is much lower than PM right here, the problem is that at that output level, if I look at what the average cost is, this here is the average cost at Q star. Right? This here is where the socially efficient price is, right? Average cost at that output level is above marginal cost. That means per unit, you lose this many dollars, and that means this firm makes a loss, right? In the long run, if a firm makes negative profits, the firm shuts down and nobody gets sewage treatment. So where should we be, right? We know that it's socially optimal to be here, welfare maximizing, but the consequence of operating at P star, Q star is one where the firm shuts down and we have no sewage treatment at all. That's clearly not a desirable state. If we let the firm do what it wants to do, it operates at 3.5 and PM, which is also not desirable. So the good answer has to be somewhere in between Q star and 3.5, which is the monopolist output level. So there are several ways of how we actually let firms operate, right? Utilities, we don't let them act as monopolists and exercise full market power. We regulate utilities. So for example, if PG&E or Southern California Edison or San Diego Gas and Electric, which are the utilities that serve about 82% of California's households, want to change their rates, meaning the price they charge you for your electricity, they can't just change it. They have to go through something called a rate hearing, which is in front of the California Public Utilities Commission, which is in San Francisco right next to the Opera. You have to go to a rate hearing with lots and lots of documentation showing who's going to be affected by these rate changes and why you should be allowed to change your rates, right? It's a very complicated process and you don't just get to set price. This could be a class all in itself. Most of us electricity nerds love this stuff, but the basic notion here is what we allow utilities to do is we allow them to break even and make a certain rate of return on their invested capital, right? So we decide there's a certain rate of return that these utilities should get to earn, 2, 3, 4%, which is sort of a reasonable rate of return on investments. So we allow them to make a slight accounting profit, right? But in economic terms, we allow them to pay for the full opportunity cost of the capital used. So ultimately, where we let these firms produce is somewhere near here. And there's subtleties as to where exactly that is, but the basic point is that we want these firms to produce, so we let them break even in the long run, where price is equal to average cost, right? And this point here is slightly above the ACQ star. This picture is getting really messy. Right. This here is P double star. It's right where price, the demand curve, intersects the average cost curve. It's a little bit to the left of what the socially optimal output level is, so less than the welfare maximizing output level, but one where the firm pays the full opportunity cost of all assets used in production, meaning it makes zero economic profits, it makes some accounting profits, but it produces closer to the socially optimal level than to what it would do if it were left alone. Now, I realize this is a sort of messy picture. I'll draw this nice and cleanly for you, and I'll throw it on BSpace so you can see clearly what's going on here. The reason it doesn't look so nice is these average and marginal cost curves down where all the action is are pretty flat, so the differences don't look very big, so I'll draw this nice and clean for you so the differences are exaggerated a little bit and you can see this clearly. All right, that's what a natural monopoly is. One of the most fun models in economics. I love it. All right, so where do monopolies come from? They come from a variety of things, right? We already discussed some last time. Maybe other substitutes are really, really far away, so you have a local monopoly over a certain good. You're the only owner of a certain resource, diamond mine somewhere. But there are scenarios where we actually create monopolies, right? There are certain markets where government goes in and allows a firm to act as a monopolist. So what we have here is essentially what the government does is it creates monopolies by generating barriers to entry into a market. So it issues, for example, a license to a firm to act as a monopolist in a certain good. So when do we do this? So for example, if you sit in your lab and you come up with a cure for Alzheimer's, and you go through the FDA trials, you show the thing is safe and effective, does everybody else just get to go into your lab, copy the formula, and produce it? No, right? What does the government do? Issues that you can... Correct, right? So for a certain amount of time, you get to be the only person that gets to produce that particular medication. You're the only person producing a medication that cures or delays the effect of Alzheimer's effectively. It's safe, and you get to earn monopoly rents on this particular medication, right? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Correct. So basically what happens is if you don't create incentives for people to be allowed to earn rents on ideas, right, the incentives to actually invest money to come up with new technologies and new ideas are greatly reduced. I wouldn't say they're zero. Right? I am still baffled by this open source movement. Right? There's a whole bunch of time. I mean, the amount of genius that is invested in bizarre open source code programs where people give you tech support for free. I program in this language called R. It's free. There's all these toolkits. You can put questions in these newsgroups, and people help you write code for free. No questions asked. They're really smart. They have really cool names and avatars. But the point here is, this argument that if there were no patents, there would be no innovation, I don't think that's necessarily true, right? There are people who are just going to innovate no matter what the rewards are, but generally speaking, if you're thinking about profit-maximizing firms, if you allow firms to license or to act as a monopolist for a certain good, incentives to come up with such a product that has huge returns are greatly increased, right? So this is a thing that we had a faculty member named Jenny Lanyao, a young lady. She tragically passed away a couple of years. She worked on these patents and property rights for medication and what the role of these patents and property rights actually are in the developing versus developed country context, right? So if you're thinking about really cutting edge, heart disease and cancer drugs and stuff like that, those things are really, really expensive. Right? So in a lot of low-income countries, nobody would buy them except for the really, really, really wealthy, but they're in the U.S. or European market for healthcare anyway. So what you're doing by allowing these monopolies is essentially granting really high prices and you're pricing people out of the market in low-income countries. So the question here was one, well, what do these firms do? By charging these prices, they're essentially foregoing profits or foregoing increased welfare in these low-income countries and thinking about how you structure intellectual property rights in order for these firms to get the right incentives and people in low-income countries to get access to these medications at probably lower prices or potentially lower prices has been an incredibly active area of research, right? So sometimes we just flat out, issue a license or we grant the right to be a monopoly over a certain period of time, patents expire, and then everybody else gets to enter the market. But sometimes we auction the right to be a monopoly. How do we ever auction? Anybody ever been to an auction? Except for maybe the private school benefit auction. Some of you may have been to. Those things are interesting. How many of you use these things? Everybody, right? I mean, who doesn't have a cell phone? Anybody still have a clamshell cell phone in here? Those things are really cool. I love those. But the point is, right, this phone has a handle on a part of radio frequency spectrum that AT&T has the right to. Nobody else gets to use that part of the spectrum. It's only well, I have AT&T, you may have Verizon or whatever it is. But the point here is AT&T has paid a lot of money in order to be the monopolist over a certain part of the spectrum. Nobody else gets to operate in that spectrum, and it can, if somebody does, it can go to the government, and the government will find out who's interfering with their part of the spectrum and gets them out of that spectrum. So the point here is the government holds auctions for certain parts of the spectrum, and then these firms step up and pay, in some cases, billions and billions of dollars in order to be the ones who get to be the sole operators in that part of the radio frequency spectrum. Right? Who gets the rents from that? The government. The government is, in theory, we the people. Right? So we as a society auction off parts of the spectrum to a private operator who thinks it's going to make profits at least as great or more than what it paid for this part of the spectrum. And in return, we the people get money from those auctions. Right? And then, of course, there's patents, which is just one way to think about a license to operate as a monopolist. Now, these examples I've given you now, I would argue, are examples of where monopolies make sense, right? Imagine if every time you tried to make a call, you had to just dial and dial and dial until you got, an open part of the spectrum. It'd be a nightmare, right? So you get reliability of service at any time you want, in theory. In practice, that's a whole different story, but we can talk about that at some other point. There are technological issues. But these are examples where monopolies actually make sense, especially in the patents case, even though there are some issues with patents. Question?
Patents are all government-created monopolies in the private sector.
Yes.
What about things that the government does itself, like driver's licenses?
Yes.
Or traditionally defense laws?
So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I can sidetrack a little bit. So the government is a big producer of goods, right? So the government produces a huge number of goods and services, physical things and services. So for example, the government, in theory, produces probably 99% of national defense, right? That's the government's job. We pay taxes. They invest in screwdrivers and tanks and stuff like that. They provide that service. They have a monopoly on national defense. There are reasons that don't necessarily relate to rents, why we would want the government that has an executive and a legislative and so on branch, right, to decide on how to use that type of good and how much of it to produce, rather than having a bunch of private firms individually decide to produce a certain level of national defense.